Good morning, America, and good evening, India. In Trump's final days, a rush of federal execution. Five executions are scheduled before President elect Joe Biden's 20th January inauguration, breaking with an 130-year-old precedent of pushing execution amid a presidential transition. And if all five take place, Mr. Trump will be the country's most prolific execution president in more than a century, overseeing the execution of 13 death row inmates since July of this year. The five executions began this week, starting with convicted killer 40-year-old Brandon Bernard, who was put to death at a penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. The execution of 56-year-old Alfred Bourgeois will take place on the evening of 11 December. Attorney General William Barr has said his Justice Department is simply upholding existing law, but critics have said the move is concerning, coming just weeks before Mr. Biden, who has said he will seek to end the death penalty, takes office. This is really outside the norm in a pretty extreme way, said Nogji Naduli, Director of Research at the Non-Partisan Death Penalty Information Center. Since the federal death penalty was reinstated by the US Supreme Court in 1988, executions carried out by the national or federal government in the US have remained rare. Before Trump took office, only 3 federal executions had taken place in this period. All were carried out under Republican President George W. Bush and included inmate Timothy McVeigh, convicted of the Oklahoma City federal building bombing since 2003. There have been no federal execution at all. US states have continued to execute inmates in state prisons, putting a combined 22 death row inmates to death last year, but state executions are also on a downward trend. A growing number have moved to abolish capital punishment altogether, and the majority have either formally banned the practice or have not put any inmates to death in more than a decade. Popular opinion too has shifted away from capital punishment. In November 2019, Gallup poll found that 60% of Americans supported life in prison over the death penalty for the first time since the survey began more than 30 years ago. Public support for the death penalty is at a decades-long low, Ms. Nadula said. Further problems have emerged with the methods of execution, sourcing drugs used for lethal injections, and the cost of decades-long court battle and appeal. In July 2019, Mr. Barr announced the scheduled execution of 5 death row prisoners. Despite prevailing practices and public opinion, Congress has expressly authorized the death penalty. The country's top legal official said in a statement at the time, the Justice Department upholds the rule of law and we owe it to the victims and their families to carry forward the sentence imposed by our justice system. The selected inmates had been convicted of murdering or raping children, and the elderly, Mr. Barr said. The move drew fierce criticism from top Democrats and human rights groups. We feel is an unconstitutionally arbitrary punishment that should have been abolished decades ago, said Lisa Seiler Barrett, Director of Policy at the NCAP Legal Defense Fund. And the particular selection of inmates fueled charges that the decision was politically motivated. The first set of execution this summer during a wave of anti-racism protest and demonstration were all of white men. Now, 4 of the 5 prisoners scheduled to be put to death are African American. Mrs. Nadole said she did not think it was coincidental that no black prisoners were scheduled for execution during a period of enhanced awareness of the racial disparities around the federal death penalty. Research suggests the death penalty has been enforced differently according to race. One of the most robust findings of study after study in jurisdiction across the country is that the race of your victim is a serious factor in determining whether or not you will have the death penalty, Mrs. Nudula said. In Alfred Bourgeois' execution goes ahead as scheduled. The 10 inmates executed in 2020 will bring a single year total unmatched in modern history. We have to go back in 1896 to find another year where there were 10 or more executions, Mrs. Nodula said. The Trump administration has also chosen to carry out federal execution in the midst of the political transition with a lame duck president for the first time in more than a century. Incumbent presidents have typically deferred to their successors, allowing President-elect to set the course. In an interview with the Associated Press, Mr. Barr defended the post-election execution and said he would likely schedule more before he leaves the Justice Department. I think the way to stop the death penalty is to repeal the death penalty, he said, but if you ask jurists to impose it, then it should be carried out. But it is controversial choice, especially as the incoming Biden administration has said it will work to end the death penalty. Bernard's execution had drawn particular attention, convicted of murder and kidnapping in 1999. Bernard was 18 at the time of his offense and would be the youngest offender executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. Five of the 9 surviving juniors in the case, as well as the US attorney who defended the death sentence on appeal, had publicly called for his execution to be stopped. Kim Kardashian also went in making a direct appeal to Mr. Trump on Twitter. Mr. Trump has been a long time vocal advocate of the death penalty. The Biden team is opposed. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, in particular, has been a consistent critic of the practice. She took a stand against capital punishment in her successful 2003 campaign for San Francisco District Attorney and declined to seek the death penalty in the murder of a 29-year-old police officer killed in the line of duty despite pressure from with her party. The president-elect's record is more uneven. Mr. Biden's 1994 crime bill added some 60 federal crimes for which someone could be put to death. Some of those on death row today were convicted under provision of his legislation. Now, he has promised to push for legislation eliminating federal execution entirely and encourage states to do the same. The Biden team has noted that more than 160 individuals sentenced to death in the US since 1973 have later been exonerated. Mr. Biden has yet to name his choice for US Attorney General. Beyond the report, Perspective USA.